Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Just Another Struggling Writer, the Beleaguered Authors one-stop shop for commiseration and hopefully inspiration. My name is Carrie Scher, and I am just another struggling writer. Well, y'all, today is Sunday, February 8th, and as you may know, if you've been following along with my writing vlogs as I have been working through my current work in progress, Secrets of Empyrean, which is my urban fantasy about a young woman with a rare magical ability who is recruited by a secret government agency to hunt down and stop a growing threat to the magical community. You probably know that I've recently started my third draft of the project. But arriving at the third draft did not come without its challenges. After completing the first draft back in June of last year, I set out for myself a challenge to finish the second draft in 12 weeks, starting pretty much at the end of June. That didn't pan out at all. I worked for about 3 weeks. I went on vacation and came back and had a major mental slump that ended up lasting like 2 or 3 months. After which I got back on the horse and I was powering through, but it just wasn't going according to plan. While I started the year off with the ultimate goal of kind of finding my way through the muck and the murk to find the heart and soul of what the story was and bring that to the fore in the third draft, what I ended up realizing was that the heart and the soul of the story was not to be found in the second draft at all. In fact, I was navigating further and further away from it the longer I wrote the second draft. And that ultimately led me to setting aside the second draft at about 75,000 words, right around the second half pinch point. But while draft 2 failed from a plot perspective, I actually learned a great deal about my story, the project in general, and about my process. So I just want to go over the top 5 things that I learned from draft 2. Number 1, not everything you come up with is going to be able to make it into the book. And this was something I had to learn not just once, but twice. And even though I did end up abandoning the draft, the things I ended up cutting from draft 2 are staying cut in draft 3. And that is because there simply just isn't enough room for them all. And I found that out the hard way. Again, not once, but twice. Certain scenes that I had envisioned from the very beginning of the plotting process, now, even before I started draft 1, I was having a hard time justifying working into the plot, to the point where there were sections of the book that felt really, really dry and slow, and then others that felt really, really bloated and busy and just like there was just too much going on, which then led to this imbalance in the book. Subplots, cool action sequences, even some minor character arcs. As much as you love them, there's just not going to be room for them all. And in draft 2, you really start having to make those hard choices of which darlings get to stay and which really do need to be lifted out. The second thing I learned from my draft 2 was to keep what you can from draft 1, but not to be too worried if it ends up not being that much. We all know that draft 1 is the vomit draft, the getting it all out onto the page to make it exist, the draft where you're telling yourself essentially the story. It's common knowledge that a draft 1 usually isn't that good unless it's part of your process to kind of edit as you go, but still, even then, the plot isn't going to be as refined as subsequent drafts. For me, you may recall that one of the things I learned in my first draft was to just write whatever sentence got me to move on. And as a result, a lot of the sentences in the first draft just weren't that great. So as I started draft 2, my first thought was that I was going to be completely rewriting the draft, but that didn't end up turning out to be true either. Turns out the first chapter was pretty good. It needed some tweaking and some updating and some reshaping, but there was a lot of it in it that was good. And since I struggle a lot in that opening snapshot, it made more sense to me to copy it over rather than try and rewrite it. However, as I got deeper into the draft and I started encountering things that I knew I was changing for the second draft, I started rewriting. So that by the time I ended up at the 75,000 word mark, I had only ended up copying over from draft 1 about 10,000 words. So really not that high a ratio at all. A lot of the sequence of events were the same, but the context was just changing so much that it didn't make a lot of sense to try and copy over. And I was still looking at draft 1 and borrowing the good lines, but a lot of times they didn't end up working and I would have to either throw them away again or figure out a way to make them work in the new draft. But again, there just wasn't that much of it. And that's okay. It's okay. Draft 1, again, is just supposed to be for your eyes only draft, the one that is telling yourself the story. Draft 2 is theoretically when you're supposed to be making it better, but it's still really early in the process. No one is expecting for you to be able to refine draft 1 into draft 2 and keep most of your work, unless that's part of your process. It didn't end up being part of mine. The third thing I learned from my draft 2, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but draft 2 for me was the time where I really started analyzing the bits of the story that worked and what didn't. If the point of draft 1 is to simply exist, to get out on the page, the point of draft 2, as the saying goes, is to make it make sense. And I found myself struggling with that wisdom a lot during draft 2, because as it turns out, some of the ideas that I had kind of latched onto, even in the transition from draft 1 to draft 2, just didn't make sense. They weren't working. And as I tried to course correct mid-draft, that is what ended up leading me further and further away from my original vision. But as much as I complain about how much time it took me to get to draft 2 only to set it aside completely, I learned a lot. The process itself taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about my character, especially her arc, what kind of arc I wanted her to have in this first book. It taught me a lot about the plot itself, what was important and what could be saved for later. This is especially salient to me because I am trying to write a long series. And so I needed to recognize that it's not as urgent to me to try and cram in everything I wanted to. Some things could be saved for later. As I was struggling through this middle section of draft 2, I was starting to realize what I didn't want the story to be specifically. And that was the direction I was moving closer into with all of the mid-draft changes that I was trying to make. So while yes, I did end up setting aside the draft because I was straying so far from my vision, I learned a lot about what not to do, what paths I shouldn't go down as I approach them in draft 3, because the threads are all still there. I just need to leave them as threads and not pull on them too hard just yet, because those are things that can be saved for later. The fourth thing I learned from draft 2 is that while yes, you are improving on draft 1, it is still way too early to be really concerned about line level revisions just yet. There were times where I felt like because I was no longer in the first draft and I was technically in revision, that I should be making every line better. But I found as I started getting into these questions I had about the plot and the character arcs and everything that was going on, that the line level stuff still was not that important. I was still needing to figure out the plot level stuff first. And so I did end up falling back on that wisdom of just get forward, just keep going to the next scene, the next line. Don't waste your time worrying about whether or not you use the same adverb twice on the same page. That can be fixed later. Because I was still doing major plot revisions, I just didn't have the time or mental energy to worry about the line level stuff. And so draft 2, if you're still in the weeds of making plot fixes, don't even worry about the line level stuff, baby. It's just, you've got plenty of time for that. Which leads me to the fifth and final thing I learned from my draft 2, which is no one is expecting draft 2 to be complete. No one is expecting draft 2, the second draft, to be readable, to be good, to be a complete product. Draft 2 is another draft that is for you. Another draft where you're figuring things out and piecing everything together, figuring out which subplots to cut, figuring out which things to amp up, figuring out what pieces of lore to bring to the forefront, figuring out how to bring out setting and make everything feel really alive, straightening out some weird hanky plot bits. I would also designate draft 2 as a for your eyes only draft, unless you are really enthusiastic about getting critique partners on board really early. I could not imagine showing a critique partner any of my draft 2, especially knowing how much I am revising the plot again for draft 3. Until you feel really secure in the narrative structure and the plot beats hitting exactly how they're supposed to be, I wouldn't waste my energy worrying about whether or not it all is good. Because in all likelihood, it's probably not. That doesn't mean it's not better than draft 1. I know as much as my second draft diverged from draft 1, it was still better. It was still an improvement. I still learned things about the character. I still learned things about the plot. I still learned things about the setting. I answered questions for myself that were big gaping plot holes in draft 1. And so yes, while it is a completely different beast from draft 1, and draft 3 is going to more closely resemble draft 1 in terms of the plot structure and everything, draft 2 was still an improvement. But it's not a finished book either, and not just because I didn't finish it. It's just not ready. But that doesn't mean it can't get ready. And that is why I am so excited to be in the 3rd draft, because I can feel it getting better. And I'm just so eager to see how this plot is going to finish out. And I can't wait for it to feel like I've really nailed down all of the plot and the character arcs and the subplots and everything, because then I can start really refining it and revising it down to something really tight and concise. But I could not start that process until I did a draft 2. So while my draft 2 process started with a bang and ended with kind of a whimper, it was an invaluable process, an invaluable lesson for me as a writer, and for me as a writer of this story in particular. I have heard authors say that each book is different and your process is going to be different, and everything is going to just feel different for every book that you write. And I definitely believe that is true. This has been such a unique process compared to other books that I have written in the past, both recreationally and when I was writing semi-professionally for script. This has really been a learning process, and it has been a real test of my commitment, because there were times during draft 2 that I thought maybe this isn't the right book for the moment. Maybe I have misunderstood what I want this book to be, and what it is becoming is something that I don't want to write. And I really did struggle with that, and that was part of my journey and part of the lore of this book when it becomes a reality. So while yes, draft 2 did end up taking me the better part of 6 months to not even finish, again, the lessons I learned were just so important for my journey and for the book. So if you are struggling through a second draft, if you're questioning whether or not it's worth it to continue, if you're having issues where the plot just isn't coming together for you, I do encourage you to press on and really analyze and explore your feelings on the project and answer questions for yourself if you still feel passionate about the book. I did at the time, even though I had those questions, and that is why I decided to set aside draft 2 and move ahead with draft 3. And that is everything for today. Thank you so much for watching. I so appreciate it. If you like my content and want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, or consider leaving a comment down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, please leave me a 2 emoji for the things that I learned in draft 2. I'm not sure what video I'm going to have for you on Friday. I have been really under the weather this week, and there won't be a vlog for sure. But I do have a poll over on my community tab right now for some suggestions I am taking for what I should do instead of a vlog. So hop on over to my community tab, place a vote in that poll, and I will have some kind of video for you on Friday. I hope you look forward to it, and I will see you then. Bye.